Next, the German Chancellor and the French President are now giving a joint speech about their EU action plan to tackle the effects of COVID-19. Let's take a listen.
We'll be talking about the contribution that France and Germany can make toward overcoming the COVID-19 crisis. This crisis is certainly the most substantial one that the EU has ever been exposed to since its inception, and clearly we have to find the appropriate responses. Cooperation in this area between France and Germany is therefore very important. The Franco-German friendship is very much here, but there are 27 of us. If France and Germany can give impetus, certainly that would be a good thing. That would make it possible to help foster common decision-making at the 27 level, so we could then be strengthened after the COVID crisis. The Ministers of Finance, with their approval, just proposed a package of guarantees under the EIB and under the European Stability Mechanism. With the SURE program, financing temporary unemployment, that's a first major contribution. We'll make sure these measures are implemented very quickly. And of course, we also need more than that, a stimulus fund, a recovery fund. And we were considering what this recovery fund should look like. We discussed it at length. The objective is for France and Germany to come out of this strengthened, further consolidated. The EU as well, strengthened and further consolidated after the crisis. We know that the COVID impact varies from one country to another within the EU, and this is why standing together is very important, cohesion. Therefore, we need economic stimulus measures if we want to boost the economy. So the Recovery Fund must make a major contribution, making it possible for the various EU countries to react depending on their needs. To that end, major efforts are going to have to be made. We're prepared to make these major efforts from France and Germany. The EU must show cohesion. We have to quickly overcome this. This is why we want to have a fund, which of course will be limited in time, but 500 billion euros will be earmarked. These won't be loans. This will be budget spending that will be earmarked to regions and sectors that are hardest hit by COVID. We're convinced that these measures are appropriate, they're necessary. It's important for the European Union to make funds available for several budget years. Subsequently, the money will have to be paid back. Of course, this will have to be in agreement with the treaties, the EU treaties, and in compliance with EU budget rules. And this must also be aligned with national budgets. Therefore, this recovery fund needs to be established on a very firm, serious legal foundation. We must respect the autonomy of national parliaments, of course. But we're going to be structuring this fund. Firstly, the Commission will be borrowing money. Then, through the Recovery Fund, we'll be able to include all of this under the 21-27 budget, an additional 500 billion, so that under this budget we'll be able to address the various difficulties that the hardest hit sectors are encountering in the hardest hit countries. This is an indispensable effort. We're convinced of that, and it'll make it possible for us to guarantee cohesion, standing together of the European Union, even more so than previously. Beyond this, we'll also be working to guarantee the further viability of the EU in upcoming years, which is to say, we will stay faithful to the Green Deal, to digitalization, to fighting disasters. We'll be creating new momentum for future years. This is what we're really underscoring through the Franco-German initiative. We'll also be working very hard on other health considerations. I'm very pleased to see that together we can together announce to you the Franco-German initiative. This is something that was indispensable. We had to make our contribution to the future of the European Union. Beyond that, There'll be an EU member state conference together with the European Parliament and the Commission to discuss the future of the Union. And of course, we'll have to discuss everything that made us realize there were certain shortcomings within the EU. Maybe this will lead to some treaty amendments. For the time being, what we're presenting to you are short-term responses to COVID. After this, there'll be medium and long-term responses. We'll tackle them at that time. Those are my points. I'd like to give the floor to the President now. Thank you very much, Madam Chancellor, dear Angela Merkel. Yes, today and in recent weeks, it's been our pleasure to have many discussions and talk several times to really build this Franco-German agreement in a unique context, as Angela Merkel has just said. It's a first-time crisis, and it's requiring, therefore, an effective collective response that needs to be a European one. We've said this, both of us have been saying it since the beginning of the crisis. This virus knows no border. It has hit all of Europe. We have to realize full well, Europe was probably lacking at the beginning of the crisis, firstly, because health skills are not under community remit. We can't ask the EU to do something about something that's not under its remit. Furthermore, there were some nationalist ideas, such as managing borders, including within the Schengen area. We have to draw all the lessons from this pandemic. Angela Merkel has just said this, and I agree entirely with everything she just said. Next, we also have to say that remarkable actions have been taken at the European level. I certainly don't forget gestures of solidarity, very specific ones that showed the human face of Europe. Solidarity which saved lives. In Germany, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Austria, they welcomed around 200 French patients. France and Germany made contributions of equipment to Italy and several other countries as well. This is solidarity, and that's also very much part of the European spirit, and it worked. It was successful. We've had a monetary and economic response. We responded from the very beginning of the crisis. The European Central Bank acted as of mid-March in a large-scale way, in an appropriate way, making it possible to avoid a short-term financial crisis and variance in interest rates throughout Europe. Very quickly, rules were established which alleviated budget constraints and competition constraints, making it possible at the national level to make sectorial responses that were absolutely necessary. The major action was also accompanied by some delays, some selfishness. I'm thinking of border issues. There are no taboos here. France, in coordination with Germany, has actively and successfully pushed to strictly close all external EU borders, but within the European Union. We feel it's different, not because we're naive, but because we want to be effective. We have to be in line with history and not show any negatives. We've issued restrictions at all of our borders, including with Germany. This was necessary. We did this in a coordinated fashion. We constantly exchanged information with and had discussions with Chancellor Merkel. We did not close our borders to all traffic. For instance, we let the 350,000 border workers continue crossing the borders to work. We also let certain products get through, essential health and food products for our countries. Other European countries didn't have that reflex. They closed all borders without alerting their neighbors, which gave a poor image of Europe. Beyond that, there are essential questions that remain, such as financial solidarity within Europe, our European sovereignty, for a stronger Europe. It's a shared belief we have with the Chancellor, which has led us to submit today this Franco-German initiative. This is thanks to bilateral work and discussions with several of our other partners. This was careful work and close work we conducted with Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Italy, several others, and the Council President as well as the EU Commission President. The Chancellor gave the outlines of the initiative. I'll just briefly come back to some of these. I'd like to emphasize the idea of consistency. There are 4 pillars in the initiative: health protection, budgetary stimulus, economic sovereignty, and environmental transition, digital transition. We feel it's the basis for rebuilding our societies, our lives, our countries that will hinge on this strategy. Absolutely. To talk about health considerations firstly, our intention together is to give Europe very specific skills in this area of health, very specific remit in the area of health, shared stock of masks and tests, abilities for purchasing and producing together or coordinating for vaccines and treatments, shared prevention plans to prevent epidemics, common endeavors to screen and list. This has never existed and has to become a priority of ours now within Europe. When it comes to budget and solidarity tools, the Chancellor just reminded us a moment ago of the importance of the Recovery Fund, 500 billion euros, which will be an additional part of our European budget. But based on the existing treaties, for the first time together, we're proposing, Germany and France together, to the 27 member states, firstly, to decide together, all of us together, to raise common debt in the market, use the 500 billion euros debt, which will then be paid back, as the Chancellor reminded us. This money will be used to provide financing targeting mainly the hardest hit sectors due to the economic and health crisis, and the hardest hit regions during this crisis will accept transfers. It's a shared strategy we're talking about to complete the European budget. This is a major stage in the process. We hope the European Commission in a few days' time will carry forward this proposal, and this will then be accepted by all of our partners. This recovery fund, the 500 billion, these won't be loans to various regions or sectors, but rather budgetary appropriations based on our common debt. This will complete the agreement entered into by our Ministers of Finance for 500 billion euros, with the SURE program reinsurance through the Commission, plus the loans under the European Stability Mechanism, as well as loans given by the European Investment Bank. 500 billion in lending, agreement by Ministers of Finance already, 500 billion in appropriations, budget appropriations, via the proposal of the Franco-German Recovery Fund. We feel this is indispensable to complete the initiatives that have already been taken and will continue to be made at the national level. A third pillar we're defending together, stepping up digital transition and green transition. The Green Deal, the green transformation of our economy, mustn't be jeopardized, but rather boosted. Sector by sector, the European recovery needs to be accompanied by conditions and commitments in the area of climate, the environment, and biodiversity. Lastly, and this is the fourth focus of our Franco-German agreement, sovereignty, genuine European sovereignty. This is the belief we share. The idea is to reduce our dependence on the outside world in strategic sectors, such as producing medicines. It also means improving the protection of our businesses, better fighting predatory investments from other powers, and also to attract and relocate key investments in Europe. Europe mustn't close itself off to global trade, and certainly not France. Sometimes, though, we have to be less naive. We have to better assist the most strategic sectors, and we believe we need to better share a common strategy of autonomy, industrial and economic autonomy. At any rate, we'll be continuing to do this and strengthening this in France and Germany. I won't speak at greater length. We'd like to field your questions now. Good afternoon, Mr. President, Madam Chancellor. I'm from Bloomberg News. You talked about a recovery fund, 500 billion, in addition to the European budget. Apparently, the 500 billion will be loans that the European Commission will contract in the financial markets. Who will repay these? What will the apportioning be of the repayment? France also emphasized the importance of direct transfers versus loans. What about these direct transfers? And then one very brief question. It's a bilateral agreement you're submitting to us today. How will you ensure that countries like Italy and the Netherlands will agree to support this proposal? On that point, precisely what we are proposing is, in compliance with the treaties, together, we would like to provide our signature so the EU can raise 500 billion euros in the financial markets. The 500 billion will then be repaid. The Commission will finalize this work. There will be a timetable and ways and means for repayment. What is certain is the 500 billion will be repaid by the beneficiaries of those that use the money. It could be repaid by member states using an apportioning key based on budgets or contributions that we might decide on together, or some other mechanism that we would decide on together with the Commission, and that will be part of finalizing the agreement. The 500 billion euros, we're proposing they be used precisely for these transfers. In other words, used to make budgetary appropriations, to transfer actual budgetary money to the regions that are the hardest hit and the sectors that have felt the greatest impact, taking into account, of course, our broader strategy. This is why we recall the importance of the Green Deal. This also means this instrument, as it's designed, enables us, during a crisis, to have a budgetary response, 500 billion euros. We're proposing this be done at the European level, something that we're already doing at the domestic level, nationally. All countries have done this to make a budgetary response at the beginning of the crisis. They raised money in the financial markets to then make that available. We're proposing doing the same thing at the European level. This is a first. These are transfers. De facto, the distribution key won't be a national key where you just look at a fair return. This is a change of philosophy. We will accept transfers, budgetary appropriations, toward sectors and regions that are the most in need and are the hardest hit. I believe this is very substantial. It's a sea change. It's something the European Union and the single market need to maintain their consistency. It's what the euro area needs to hold together. The work already began with the Chancellor. We've had discussions with all of our partners. Some of them wanted much greater amounts, mechanisms that might have been less pure than this one. Others, maybe initially at the beginning of the crisis, might have been hostile to any type of transfer. In recent hours, we briefed our partners on this agreement, working together with the President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission. Our work with them will be to continue working on this and discussing it. I think the next important stage will be the proposal that the European Commission President will make, and the Commission will then table. It will be the basis for work with all member states and bringing them together. Thank you. If I might address this point, you have to realize for the time being we don't have a several-year budget framework for 2021-27, so the budget still has to be crafted. At the same time, for the initial years of that period, we'll need to increase resources. This will be done using the budgetary process. As a member state, of course, we need ratification by the European Parliament, which will authorize the Commission to raise money in the financial markets. That money will then be spent in the short term and then paid back in the longer term. The distribution key remains the same for the various countries, but, of course, the countries that were the hardest hit, that have suffered the most, will get the most of these resources. That's the governing philosophy in this initiative. That's what's original. We're moving down a new road to cope with a crisis that's unique and a first. A question now from Berlin, from Reuters. I have a question for President Macron and Chancellor Merkel. It has to do with technology sovereignty, which you mentioned, particularly President Macron, you mentioned this. What does this boil down to exactly? This money, is it going to be earmarked for technologies that will guarantee our future sovereignty? What does this mean regarding China? Will we be changing our policy regarding Huawei, for instance? What about questions such as that one? I wouldn't limit it to any specific area. I would say we have many strategic projects in the EU.